My name is Jason Cannon from IHS. Welcome. Our lecturer is Jacob T. Levy, and he is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill University. He's the author of the books The Multiculturalism of Fear and Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, as well as numerous articles in the academic and popular press. He's the political theory editor for the Journal of Politics, and his own research is on federalism, freedom of association, indigenous peoples, constitutional theory, and Enlightenment political thought. And I love this note. It's been 30 years since his first IHS summer seminar. This lecture, his first of 3 at this seminar, is titled The Crisis of Constitutional Democracy. And Professor Levy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you to all of you whom I cannot see in this new awkward format, but I'll do my best to speak to you as if you're there. My talk today is not going to be the presentation of something like a liberal theory of politics or a liberal theory of government. It's rather going to address some combination of theoretical and historical issues in the government and politics of liberal societies. And it's partly a talk about questions that we've learned to ask, not questions that we've learned how to answer yet, and ways in which traditional inherited theoretical rules about what a system of government for a free society could look like have proven to be unsatisfactory and have left us with challenges that we don't yet really know completely how to address. Now, academics like to laugh when a student begins a paper by talking about something that's been true since the dawn of time, and then political theorists always turn around and say, well, since Greece. That's where I'm going to start. Well, since Greece. The ancient Greeks developed ideas about what kinds of governing options were available that have given us vocabularies that we use to this day. Their central distinctions were among government by the few, the one, or the many. In the most traditional version of that distinction between the many, democracy, the few, aristocracy, and the one, monarchy. These were all viable positions among the Greek city-states. In the world of ancient Greece, there were cities that were governed as democracies, that is, ruled by the many from among the free citizens. And the free citizens wasn't everyone. It didn't include women, it didn't include foreigners, it didn't include slaves, but it included a great many people, a much larger proportion of the population than was true in the systems that called themselves aristocracies, to say nothing of those that called themselves monarchies. Ruled by the few, understood normally to mean the wealthy, or the one, understood to be the most powerful. Ancient Greek politics was marked by serious ideological and political conflict among would-be democrats, would-be aristocrats, and would-be monarchs. There was ideological conflict among the Greek city-states, famously between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. And there was serious ideological conflict within the Greek city-states, many of which at one time or another fell into civil war between especially advocates of democracy and advocates of aristocracy. Now, all of these were understood as ways of organizing a whole political system. When the Democrats won a fight in one of these ancient Greek city-states, that wasn't understood to be one party taking power for a while. It was understood to be complete reformation of the governing system of that city. So while, yes, the Democrats as a group were most often in control in ancient Athens in particular, Athens was also understood to be a democracy. And those two thoughts were not kept neatly distinct. There was no way within democratic Athens for the aristocrats to sometimes take power and then leave it again. For the aristocrats to take power was to transform Athens into an aristocracy. Now, when the ancient Greek political philosophers began their serious work of thinking about the question, what form of government is best? They did a couple of things. One is they introduced new distinctions besides the distinction among the one, the few, and the many that was common in political practice and public political debate. They introduced more or less distinctions between those versions when they're good and those versions when they're bad. There was rule by the one, the few, and the many when conducted according to law, and government by the one, the few, and the many when conducted lawlessly. Or there were other versions of characterizing that good-bad distinction. But in the most famous version of that distinction, we saw in Aristotle monarchy, that is lawful rule by one, distinguished from tyranny, that is lawless or despotic rule by one. Aristocracy, lawful rule by the few, and here it's important that the few mean the excellent. Aristos literally means the excellent. And oligarchy, rule by the rich, which tended to be lawless and despotic. The bad, lawless rule by many was, Plato, democracy. And then there was a hypothesized form of good rule by the many, lawful, reasonable, stable rule by the many. This Aristotle gave the name politeia, polity, which was also, as he noted, the generic name for the Greek city-states themselves, and which was also not neatly distinguishable from the idea already in common parlance of mixing the various kinds of government. Aristotle became one of the originators in Western philosophy of the idea that the best form of government would be one that mixed in some underspecified way, rule by the many, the few, and the one. The general population would be able to signal popular acceptance. The few, the excellent, would be able to reach actual governing decisions when those were difficult to reach. And the one, the monarch, could lend unity and stability and reach urgent decisions when urgent decisions were needed. That left behind a vocabulary that outlived the era of the ancient Greek city-states themselves and that we have with us to this day. We no longer talk very much about politeia, but democracy, aristocracy, oligarchy, those are all still words in common use. Monarchy, tyranny, those are words that we use. And politeia gave way to something like constitutional. Constitutional is not a Greek word. Constitutional is a Roman word, a Latin word. And when the ancient Romans took on much of the philosophical work and the history of the Greek city-states that they encountered when they conquered Greece and absorbed its cultural legacy, the Romans came to see their own inherited governing order, one that they had developed piecemeal and through struggle, not by conscious design. But they came to understand their own political order as being a mixed regime, one that included the many, the few, and the one. The Roman Republic had been founded when the few, the aristocrats, the wealthy military elite, overthrew a monarchy that they accused of behaving lawlessly. They replaced the monarchy, the one, with decision-making power by two people who would jointly reach the key decisions over the course of a year and then would step down again. They sought to limit the power they'd associated with the monarchy, and so they created a two-person limited term substitute for it. After not too many decades, the general population of Rome, the people, demanded its own place in the governing structures, arguing that the military elite, the aristocracy, was not giving them their due voice or respecting their traditional privileges. And so the version of the Roman Constitution that endured through most of the Roman Republic was explicitly mixed. It was mixed between the Senate of Rome, probably the most powerful body through most of this period of time, and that's the aristocratic body where the military elite generated an aristocratic, wealthy elite over the course of generations. the Senate, the people, the popular assembly, and those two elite leaders who served for a year, who took the place of the old monarchs. That hybrid constitution, the Senate and the people of Rome, generated in Latin the acronym SPQR, which was emblazoned on the shields of the soldiers of the Roman Republic. That is, they went into battle with a visible reminder that what they were fighting for was the Roman constitution, a constitution that, after they absorbed Greek philosophy, they came to describe as being so good and so effective precisely because it fulfilled these demands the Greeks had identified for a mixed regime in which all different parts of society had their place. Now, if Aristotle had underspecified institutionally what that could mean, he didn't really tell us what the few, the many, and the one would do. The Romans, who were very procedural and legalistic, gave a great deal more institutional shape to, in ways that we went on to inherit to this day. Most obviously to Americans, the upper house, the place where the aristocrats sat, was the Senate. Why Senate? Senate has the root of the Latin word for old. It's the same root word as senile. Why is the Senate made up of those who are old? Well, because it's made up of the heads of families. And to be the head, the paterfamilias, of one of the great aristocratic families of ancient Rome, that means you've outlived your father, your grandfather. You've come to take headship of a family. You don't get elected to the Senate by being a clever young thing. You take your seat in the Senate by virtue of inheriting it from your father upon his death. So the Senate is where the old, and as it would come to be self-understood, the wise, would get together to make the most important sets of political and legal decisions. The popular assembly, which for a great deal of the Roman Republic's history was primarily in person attended by the masses of Roman citizens of the city of Rome, a vast, vast assembly that cheered, gave vocal acclamation in order to say what it approved of or didn't approve of, served as an ongoing check on the Senate, limiting the ability of the aristocrats to overreach and serving to give honors and to give dishonor. And the two consuls who headed the system, occasionally for 1 year, the dictator, the one person who headed the system in times of emergency, had a kind of command of the military forces and of foreign questions, though subject always to a great deal of supervision by the Senate. That understanding, the mixed regime as the Roman constitution, providing evidence through the long life of the Roman Republic that it was a very good kind of constitution, that was to exert a tremendous influence on the memory and the imagination in the West of what good government of a republican free society could be like. The Roman Republic falls. It is succeeded by the Roman Empire, and then the empire falls. Jumping ahead those 1,000 years, the 500 or so years of the empire and the 500 or so years after the empire falls. In the early Middle Ages, the emergent kingdoms of Western Europe began to piecemeal and haphazardly create a new form of mixed government. They didn't do so in order to emulate the Romans, and they didn't do so because Aristotle told them to. They did so because rule is always easier with the cooperation of those who are ruled. To some degree, rule requires the cooperation of those who are ruled, only to some degree, and only some of those who are ruled. A monarch really can't rule entirely by himself. He relies on the cooperation of important elites representing the military, representing economic productive power, and in medieval Europe, representing religious power. The monarch needs their help relies on their sense that his rule is legitimate. They, in turn, can't rule a population that is entirely unwilling to be ruled. More than that, to the degree that they want to extract material resources from the large group of people over whom they rule, and that's one of the things that rulers always want, to the degree they want to extract material resources, they need some cooperation. Functioning political societies cannot exist in a state of nothing but war between those who rule and those who are ruled. Over the course of the early Middle Ages, first, there was an institutionalization, a formalization of cooperation by the few with the monarchs. From 500 to 1000 or so, a system had come up that we've come to know as feudalism, in which kings had a little bit of power over a lot of individuals, who in turn a lot of power over subordinate nobles or knights or serfs. What changes in the 11th century, the 12th century, is that instead of the king treating with nobles individually, the king started to call together at least some subset of the higher nobility, often along with members of the higher priesthood, as a kind of regularly meeting council. This becomes the House of Lords in England, and it becomes parallel bodies, the First Estate in France, and similar kinds of bodies in Spain and elsewhere in Western Europe. At the same time, wealth is beginning to grow in new commercial cities over the course of the especially 12th and 13th centuries. The cities are becoming very important sites of wealth. Monarchs would rather get some of their wealth from the cities than from aristocrats, because aristocrats are always potential military threats to them. And eventually monarchs come to realize that they need the wealth from the cities. There's too much wealth growing there to be able to rely entirely on the material support that nobles provide by supplying their own armed forces. And so the monarchs start to call representatives of the cities, demanding that they consent to be taxed, which is to say that they cooperate in being taxed. The idea of taxation without representation is tyranny, a slogan that was to be influential during the American Revolution, and which drew on a tradition in English political practice that was by then a few centuries old. It finds its roots in the basic fact that taxation is very much easier with representation. The king could call representatives of the city to meet together in what becomes eventually the House of Commons or the Third Estate, demand that they agree to, maybe negotiate some about the limits of, but demand that they agree to a new tax, which they would then go back to their cities and explain, I've authorized that we will pay this. We see the one, the few, and the many recreated as a hybrid system. Now, what was true to some degree in Rome is true to an even greater degree in this medieval constitution. The one, the few, and the many don't occupy clearly distinct institutional roles. What comes to be known as the theory of English and then British sovereignty is that the sovereign is the king or queen in parliament. It's the hybrid body, the one, the monarch, the few, the House of Lords, and the many, the House of Commons, acting together in concert, can pass any law, can do anything. There are particular traditions about which of those groups can do what when they're not acting together. But there aren't clear rules. There are sufficiently unclear rules that England fights a civil war over in the mid-17th century. And there are sufficiently unclear rules that the equivalent bodies, the States General and its parallels elsewhere on the European continent, break down as monarchs become more and more powerful over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. The idea, however, was in place, and it was in place in what was understood to be a recent way, that the best constitution was that which had come together haphazardly, but which turned out to share these features with the ancient Roman constitution and with the ancient Greek philosophical system. It's not until the late 17th or arguably the 18th century that all of this becomes joined to what we think of under the phrase of the separation of powers. There's a little bit in John Locke, whom I'm going to skip talking about today because I'm going to talk about Locke a lot tomorrow. But the fullest statement of the theory is assembled by the Baron de Montesquieu, a French theorist whose Spirit of the Laws in 1748 looked to the English constitution of his day, identified it as the freest in the world, and attributed that freedom to the way that powers were separated. He's the first to identify the powers of government as legislative, the making of laws, executive, the carrying out of laws, and judicial, the application of laws to particular cases and the interpretation of laws. Montesquieu looks at England and he says the legislative power sits in the House of Commons, which by 1748 was substantially true. The Glorious Revolution had more or less settled that legislative initiative didn't sit with the king, the right to initiate taxes didn't sit with the king. The House of Commons was coming to be the most powerful part of the British Constitution. But it was not yet a system with a relatively powerless monarch as it is today. The monarch still had fundamental power to appoint a government, to appoint ministers, and through the appointment of ministers, really significant control over military affairs and foreign affairs. So the executive, the site of rapid decision-making, the executive was to be found in the monarchy. And the judicial power, Montesquieu awkwardly placed in the House of Lords. Now, here are things that were true of the House of Lords by this time. A number of judges sat by right in the House of Lords. They were known as the Law Lords, and they made the House of Lords the court of highest appeal in Britain. Mostly the high aristocracy didn't take any part in this. The House of Lords as a whole generally didn't sit as a court. But the House of Lords housed the court of highest appeal. And moreover, the House of Lords was the key site for impeachment trials. It was where ministers of the king could be impeached, or also other members of the House of Lords could be impeached for serious misconduct in office. Montesquieu maintains that because the few, the many, and the one have a kind of natural social attachment to their respective standing and status, that they will fight to keep those powers distinct. And it's keeping the powers distinct that, for Montesquieu, is the key to maintaining freedom in a governed society. If you don't have the powers separated, then the monarch is always at risk of throwing his enemies in jail for no reason other than being his enemies. If the monarch can legislate and judge, then the monarch will legislate against opposition to himself and will judge in particular cases. You are my enemy, into the Tower of London you go. England had slowly overcome that kind of thing. France, very much less so, and this was of great concern to Montesquieu, and a great deal of why he's writing all of this in the Spirit of the Laws, is to argue that France is losing what liberty it had because the powers are insufficiently separated. And the French monarchy was at risk of becoming a despotism. It didn't have a proper separation of powers. But the key thing for our purposes is Montesquieu says the separation of powers is strong in England because they've lined up the powers with the old social classes. This is not the vision of harmony, of the king in parliament, of all three acting together as one. It's not really the vision of harmony that we find in ancient Greek philosophy or that we found in idealizations of Roman practice. It's a theory of the one, the few, and the many in a kind of structured, ongoing institutional conflict. A few decades later, as the new American Republic is trying to form a government, drawing on the whole history of Republican thinking about what makes for good, effective constitutional governments of free societies and what immunizes them against eventual collapse into rule by the one. The founders looked a great deal to Montesquieu, and they were deeply concerned with the separation of powers. Their problem was that, unlike England, unlike France, the new United States had no aristocracy, to say nothing of a monarchy, sitting around. How could it be that the powers would remain separated if they weren't attached to social classes that were trying to stand up for their separate social statuses? The founders' theory, as articulated in the Federalist Papers, was that a belief in the status of one institutional, an attachment to the job one occupies in government, an attachment to Congress or court or presidency, will be enough. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The way that will happen is because, of course, Congress will never give the president the power to overturn the constitutional order. Of course, Congress will never give the president the power to make himself dictator, because Congress is concerned with Congress's status. So you give each of the institutions enough power to effectively check and limit the others. And then you can have separation of powers in a republic without an aristocracy, without a monarchy, where even the Senate isn't really understood anymore as being the body representing the wealthy. It is to a certain degree understood as representing the old. The age requirement to get in the Senate is higher than that to get into the House. But the electorate is the same. The people at large vote for the House, the Senate, the President, and equivalently for Houses, Senates, and governors in the states. The belief is that judges will stand up for the prerogatives of judges, legislators will stand up for the prerogatives of legislators, and executives will stand up for the prerogatives of executives. And the system will thereby retain its balance. This is Republican in the Roman sense, Republican constitution making at what turns out to be its high point. Because very rapidly, the circumstances that underlie Republican theory were eroding. One of the key thoughts of Republican political theory throughout all of the intervening centuries from Rome till 1787 was the serious danger posed by faction or party. It's okay to have different institutions, but they must all be aiming at the common good. And republics will inevitably collapse. They'll collapse into the kinds of civil wars that broke up the Greek city-states and that broke up many of the Italian cities that were republics in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. They'll break into civil war if they have political parties. It's only a handful of years after the American Constitution is ratified that parties begin to emerge. The Federalist and Democratic Republican parties, each operating as they understand defensively, because the other side is conspiring against the Constitution. We must organize until they're defeated, and then it will go away. And then we'll get back to good Republican common good government. Turns out they were wrong, and they were wrong in a way that has had enduring consequences for how we understand representative and constitutional democracy in liberal societies. And here I'm emphasizing liberal as distinct from the Republican, anti-commercial, agrarian, common good orientations that some of the founders had inherited from earlier ideology. For the government of liberal societies, governed democratically in the modern era, we now know, as the American founders didn't because they couldn't, we now know that you can't do it without political parties. There is no case of ongoing democratic government in a large state in the modern world in which elections are not primarily organized around partisan competition. This is a crucial way of restraining the ambitions of any one executive. It's a crucial way of restraining the greed of any one generation of legislators, because the party has a long-term interest. The party has a long-term interest in restraining truly catastrophic or scandalous or calamitous kinds of rule. If you discredit the party, then the party will suffer. You'll retire or die, but the party will go on paying the price. And therefore, the American constitutional order, badly enough designed, they had to rewrite the rules for electing the president and vice president within a generation. Badly enough designed that it could take no real account of political parties, but able, once they made that change to the election of the president and the vice president, able to stumble on, despite the advent of parties, made enough room for partisan competition to do the real essential work of providing mutual accountability in an ongoing democratic society. Parties are not powers. The competition between parties is not the separation of powers. The competition between parties is each party always watching the other for when they do something wrong, able to then go back to the electorate at the next election and say, look at the catastrophe that this government has provided, vote us into power and vote them out of power. Not only is the separation of parties not the same as the separation of powers, it exists really awkwardly with it. And this is true in both of the major varieties of constitutional democracy that have gone on to govern liberal societies in the 200 years since the American founding. In parliamentary systems, which are easier in some ways to understand, the executive, the prime minister, and the ministerial cabinet just are drawn from the majority party or majority coalition in the larger or lower house of parliament, the House of Commons, the House of Representatives. The prime minister is the leader of the party that commands a parliamentary majority. That makes it difficult for parliament to hold the prime minister to account. Prime ministerial mismanagement isn't something that the parliament wants to draw attention to, because the prime minister is of the same party as the majority of parliament. And so there has been a tendency for parliaments to let ministers, and especially prime ministers, more and more off the hook for scrutiny for their misconduct. In a presidential system, where the president is elected separately from the legislature, in the American case from Congress, then we have two different possible outcomes. In one outcome, the president is of the same party as the majority of Congress. This is very often the case in at least the first 2 years of a presidential term. And when that's true, the founders turn out to have been wrong. Simply saying, I'm a member of Congress, I'm a senator, I'm a representative, doesn't give people so much pride in their office that they are determined to hold the president to account. Instead, they say, I'm a member of the same party, the same team as the president. We are going to run on a shared ticket. We are not in the business of holding the president to account, of limiting the unlawful use of presidential power or authority, of preventing presidential self-enrichment, of preventing presidential abuse of military authority or command over the bureaucracy or what have you. It might seem to be easier when the opposition party controls one or both houses of Congress, but when they do, it can be easily argued, and it inevitably is argued, that any attempt to hold the president to account is just more partisan competition. And so Congress will seek to hold members of cabinet accountable, will demand oversight over expenditures, will demand oversight over whether congressional statutes have been appropriately followed and carried out by the executive branch. And the executive branch, belonging to the other political party, will shout and scream that this is nothing but partisan warfare. And sometimes it is. In neither system, in neither arrangement, when Congress belongs to the same party as the president or Congress belongs to the opposite party of the president, do we have the kind of clear self-enforcing separation of powers checking one another that was hoped for by the founders and idealized by Montesquieu. People's sense of belonging to the same political team in a party is crucial to the survival of democracy in large states, but it badly undermines the ability of those states to carry out what Montesquieu and the founders agreed was crucial. Republican democratic constitutional governments don't have the one, the few, and the many. They inherited an institutional structure from the Romans, from Republican thought, from Greek philosophy, and from medieval and early modern European practice. They inherited these institutions that no longer have the same social class meaning that Montesquieu attributed to them. And the founders' hope that they could get away without the social class meaning has proven to be importantly compromised. Are too important to the good functioning of democracy, and parties are too incompatible with the good functioning of the separation of powers. All of that is a set of challenges. It is not yet what my title promised, which is a crisis. Constitutional democracy has, however, an ongoing set of very serious risks associated with this mismatch between institutional form and the reality of partisan competition. I talked about the degree to which Republican ideology, including the ideology of the American founders for the most part, distrusted party, distrusted faction, believed in the unity of the people acting for the sake of the common good. The reality of liberal society as it was coming to be at the end of the 18th century and came fully to be over the course of the 19th, is of a society that is so pluralistic and differentiated, partly due to the division of labor, partly due to the proliferation of different religions and religious worldviews, partly due simply to the advent of a wide variety of political ideas. Liberal societies are too pluralistic for that Republican vision to be viable. And yet we still have an ongoing normative and rhetorical attachment to the idea of being a unifier, to the idea of the common good, to the idea of the people standing together. That is to say, in the United States, and not only in the United States, I think this is a common feature of constitutional democracies around the world, we're uneasy with how important parties are, with how much we depend on political division. That uneasiness lends itself easily to the voice of someone who says he can speak in the name of the whole people, the whole nation. Let us overcome our differences. Let us come together as one and follow me. Why me? Why is it always the one? Well, it's always the one for a couple of reasons. One, simply that legislatures and courts are pluralistic. You look at Congress, you see people fighting. You look at a president or a governor or a prime minister, and you see one person with one voice. If he can tell a convincing story about why the will of the nation manifests in his will, his decisions, and I'm using male pronouns here really advisedly and determinedly, overwhelmingly what we find is that this is a phenomenon of male chief executives, though of course, mostly we've had male chief executives in the world in any case. The one who can say, I speak in the voice of the whole, has a decisive rhetorical advantage over those who, well, necessarily don't, like judges and legislators. Moreover, the many can very often be tempted into an alliance against the few. If this was true for the poor and the rich in ancient Greece, it remains true in a variety of ways in our pluralistic societies to this day. An important line of political rhetoric is always that I will stand with you, the people, against they, the elites. This goes in multiple political and ideological directions. They, the elites, might be the wealthy. They, the elites, might be the cultural and academic elites associated with Hollywood or universities. They might be foreign elites. They might be bankers. They might be Jews, who often manage to be the shared ideological enemy of populists of the left and the right. They are the wealthy and the intellectuals and the cosmopolitans all together. But there's a temptation on the part of large parts of the electorate to respond to a rhetorical appeal from the person who holds the power of the one, saying, I will take your side against the sides of the elites. The judges, the lawyers, the professors, the bankers, the wealthy, the actors, the foreigners, the minorities, or whatever. Add that to the fact that the power of the executive is the hardest power to constrain in constitutional democracies to begin with. The greatest concern that Montesquieu had, and a very live concern for the American founders, was that the executive had control of the police and the military. If there's a danger to free government, the first foremost danger of it is that someone will use his distinct control of armed force to attack the legislature, to shut down the free secondary institutions, to intimidate the courts, to imprison or torture or kill his enemies. The command of the police, the secret police, the intelligence services, and the military makes the executive unparalleled in his power compared with the other branches. The ability to join that to the ideological appeal, I speak for the many against the few, I speak for all of us together against partisan division, means that there's a real ability for executives or candidates for the executive office to commit to demagoguery and populism as a rhetorical strategy, enabling authoritarianism in office. This, by the way, like what I said earlier about the problem of separation of powers and separation of parties, this is true in presidential and parliamentary systems alike. There are some particular dangers associated with each, but the general phenomenon that you can have a president or a prime minister say, I don't speak for a party, I speak for the nation. Therefore, when I use the military, the police, and the secret police, you should trust that I do so for the sake of the common good. There's the risk of serious crisis to constitutional democracy. It's not the case that the three branches are equal. It's not even the case that the governing party and the opposition party are equal, because the opposition party must always emphasize a division. The governing party can pretend that there's no division and that it and its leader speak for the whole. This introduces a fragility into constitutional democracy, into the marriage between these Roman and medieval institutions and our modern discovery about how to run democracies based on partisan electoral competition. A tension between them that we have not yet fully learned how to resolve. And there are some structural reasons to doubt will admit of permanent resolution. The asymmetry in power between executive and other branches, and the rhetorical appeal of speaking for the whole against the parts when we need parties, those are likely to be enduring features. And those are features that put the survivability of the constitutional democratic government that we've found to be the most effective kind of government for the survival of free societies at a kind of permanent risk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Levy. So our graduate students are going to head to their breakout groups. Everyone else will have a 30-minute break, and then we will return here at 6 p.m. for the Q&A. So in the meantime, feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box here. I will be gathering those, collecting them where there's some overlap, and then we will have a rapid fire response from Professor Levy in half an hour. So thank you. Okay, and we are back for the Q&A. We have So many great questions, far more than we would be able to cover in half an hour or an hour's worth of Q&A. So we're going to keep this pretty quick and get through as many as we can, but we won't be able to get through all of them. But thank you for submitting these. All right, so the first one is crisis overstating it? The system of government that we have in the West has seemed to endure past problems. So is this a new level of dire?
There's a tendency that political scientists talk about for democratization and liberalization to happen in waves or by contagion. And to some degree, we don't know whether that's because similar historical forces are operating on lots of countries at the same time, or because countries are influencing one another. And we think it's probably some of both. There's some clear evidence that in the post-financial crisis, post-2008 world, the wave of liberalization and democratization that was associated with the fall of military dictatorships in Southern Europe and Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s, the democratization of East Asian countries in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, and then the liberalization and democratization of the post-communist world, of the then communist world, has crested and fallen back. And some of what I want to do is identify some of the common features that we're seeing across liberal or relatively liberal, democratic or relatively democratic societies, because I think there are very common features that we can spot from the United States to India to Hungary to Israel to Brazil, Britain to a lesser degree, Austria to a considerable degree. There's a wave of something happening. That doesn't mean that all those countries or that any of those countries will necessarily suffer a complete breakdown of their constitutional democracies. But it does mean that I think we want to be able to talk in terms of things sometimes being worse. And I do think we have good historical reason to think this is a sometimes worse moment. And if you'll do me the favor of then subsequently asking me the immediately preceding question about the founders and the American system, then I can talk a little more about why.
Sure, great. So even if the founders didn't anticipate parties, didn't their system pretty easily accommodate them?
Great, and a good objection, but the answer is basically no. So the American party system has been a very strange creature over the course of 2.25 centuries. It has very rarely been the case that there were actually two parties fully competitive at the national level. After the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson swept into power, the Federalist Party was never again a serious challenger for power at the national level. For generations, some remnants of the Federalist Party became a Whig party that was very important in the Senate and important in some states, was never serious tender control of the House of Representatives and the presidency, which are the more powerful branches. The Whig Party collapses over slavery. A Republican Party forms out of its ashes. After the Civil War, the Republican Party enjoys almost unchallenged rule for decades and is really only challenged occasionally when the Democratic Party, then understood as the party of the Confederacy and the losing side in the Civil War, crept very close to the Republican platform for one term or two terms, and so on and so on. The post-New Deal era was not a competitive era. Now, part of this for the whole post-Civil War era was because of the cross-cutting cleavages of party and race. The parties did not neatly ideologically sort because there was, in the post-New Deal era, a party that included the Southern Confederates, Southern whites, and blacks nationwide. The Republican Party, as the party of Northern white liberals, was at a structural disadvantage there, and the parties weren't ideologically well sorted. Political scientists talk about a realignment and sorting of the American political party system that really only reached its full form in 1994, as recently as that. Since 1994, the American political parties have been more closely competitive for longer than was ever before true in American history. For a quarter century now, control of the House of Representatives has gone back and forth, control of the Senate has gone back and forth, control of the presidency has gone back and forth. And 2 presidential elections have been decided by hair's breadths. Associated with that, we find that there is a dramatic polarization. And so some of the things I was talking about, ways that relationships between an opposition-controlled Congress and a presidency could be strained to the breaking point. They often didn't happen in the pre-1994 era because the parties were so ideologically strange and regionally strange because of this distinctive post-Civil War mixture having to do with race. The post-1994 parties have had 2 impeachments, 2 presidential impeachments in 25 years, which is as many as in the whole of American history up until that time. They've had a tremendous upsurge in serious fights, serious jurisdictional constitutional fights when the president and Congress are controlled by opposing parties. So there's a degree to which the American system lucked into being able to survive parties through accidents that had no real relationship to the advent of parties. And there's a way in which now, post-1994, we're seeing the party system fully developed at last, and we're seeing the kind of strain that it can put on the system at last.
How has the growth of what we want from government changed this dynamic?
So this is, at the very beginning, I said, I'm not going to offer a classical liberal or a liberal theory of politics. I'm going to offer a theory of politics in liberal societies. Questions like this are part of what I have in mind. There's one important strand of classical liberal scholarship that treats the demand for government, or the demand for government services, or the demand for size and scope of government as being the key independent variable, and political facts as then being the dependent variables. As a political scientist, that's not how I think. I think that the demand for control over the mechanisms of rule is a pretty permanent fact, and is much more fundamental than demands for redistribution at the level of 2 or 3 or 4% of GDP. The competition to be the one in charge of the army, the competition to be the one in charge of the ideological apparatus telling people what to think, the competition to be the one whose heirs will survive rather than the ones whose heirs will be killed because there's a violent contest for political power. Those are really enduring facts of human political organization and political order. And all the kinds of struggles that we saw talked about in ancient Greece, talked about in the Middle Ages, talked about in Rome, they just treated this general fact that political competition was present as permanent, even though in even the most redistributionist democratic of ancient Greek city-states, actual public control of the economy was very much less than is true for any modern constitutional democracy. Just as a matter of subsistence, when you're much closer to subsistence, a society cannot afford 20 or 25 or 30% of its total produce being taken away from the basic project of feeding the population. Richer societies can, and richer societies do. And there's not tremendous variation across modern constitutional democracies. All modern constitutional democracies, that is to say, all of the societies that have been marked by liberal commercial society, by liberal capitalism, by the kind of economies that supporters of market liberalism celebrate, all of the constitutional democracies that govern societies like that have government share of GDP much closer to each other than they do to any of the ancient systems. And I don't think that we see any real variation that's driven just by level of redistribution as a predictor of the kinds of crisis I'm talking about, because level of redistribution isn't what determines whether people want to be in charge of the military or not.
So while we're on the subject, can you say a little bit more about the relationship between democracy and liberalism?
Yes. So here's a quick plug for the pieces that I posted online, the pieces of writing. This is something that I've been working on in my academic research for a while. there are long-standing reasons for distrust of democracy and democratic politics that run through classical liberal political theory in particular, and liberal political theory in general. One of my chief influences as a liberal political theorist is the theorist Judith Shklar, who famously said that liberalism is permanently, monogamously married to democracy, but it is a marriage of convenience. Democracy and liberalism are not the same idea. That people should live their lives freely is a separate question, logically a separate question, from the question of how shall government be organized, however much government we have. It turns out, however, that they are not so distinguishable empirically, historically, sociologically, as they are at that formal level. And I think there's been an excessive amount of attention paid in liberal political philosophy in general, classical liberal political thought in particular, to the formal distinction, a desire to say, well, since we live in democracies, and it's democracies that keep passing these laws we don't like, therefore democracy is the enemy of liberty. No, democracy is a system of government, and any system of government is going to, at one time or another, threaten liberty to some degree. It is, however, the case that for these liberal, commercial, capitalist societies, for the extended market orders of the last 2 centuries, their fit with constitutional democracy as a method of government has been very much closer, very much better than to other alternative methods of government. That doesn't mean we allow sheer majoritarianism. It doesn't mean we prefer untrammeled democracy to constitutional democracy. But I think that it's important to recognize the real historical contribution that democracy made to the emergence of liberal, legal and economic and social systems. The equalization of legal status. We all can own property. We all can enter into contracts. We all have equal legal rights. Has a very strong affinity with the equalization of political status. We can all form political parties. We can all vote. We can all run for office. And when one of those is lost, when, say, incumbent property owners and the wealthy restrict access to the franchise, restrict political competition, suppress political parties of the left, they at the same time reconfigure the economy in ways that are no longer free, open, liberal, competitive market orders, but are instead rent-seeking protections for incumbent property owners. There's a stronger affinity between democracy and liberalism that is often recognized, and those pieces of writing I put on the website have more to say about those things.
Okay. And by the way, for everybody listening, those essays are available on the participant website, so you can download those and read them at your leisure. So just have time for a couple more questions. Very briefly, were the Articles of Confederation flawed by granting too much power to the states? Did we actually need the greater executive power that the Constitution granted?
That's a question, but it combines 2 different thoughts. Arguably, the Articles were flawed in both those dimensions, and the founders in 1787 thought the Articles were flawed in both those dimensions, but we could distinguish them. One of the ways in which the federal government was weak was that it didn't have a meaningful executive power, didn't have the ability to effectively carry out a shared military or foreign policy, and suspicion of monarchical power was so strong that there wasn't meaningfully an executive with an independent capacity to act. I think it could have been the case that there could have been a replacement for the Articles that strengthened the executive branch at the federal level without so much strengthening the relative balance between the center and the states. I don't know how that would have worked out. It might have looked like a constitution that on paper I would have liked better, but part of the kind of story that I'm telling about how things turned out is that systems either adapt or don't adapt for reasons that are hard to predict at the outset. From the perspective of 1787, I think we would certainly say the federal government needed to have meaningful executive power, which it didn't. And we might well have said that there was cause for some greater federal power over the states from almost any ideological perspective, classical liberal or civic Republican or what have you, that, for example, the states didn't have a free trade zone with one another, that the states were carrying out more or less independent foreign policies, that the states were carrying out definitely independent military policies. All of those were real threats to the viability of the Republic at that stage, even if one looks at the actual 1787 Constitution and says, I wish they hadn't given Congress that power and that power, or the president that power and that power.
Sure. Okay. And the last question, very quickly, just because it's so fun and combines a couple questions that we got. Is the solution to this crisis some sort of spontaneous emergent order? And is that answer anarchy?
Yay, now it's an IHS seminar. It's never really an IHS seminar until you get the anarchy question. So I've been stressing in these answers, even more than in my talk, a kind of permanent character of political life. And I really think that that's a true thing. It's not the only true thing about human social orders. There are true things having to do with resource scarcity. There are true things having to do with social status. There are true things having to do with tribalism and collective identity. One of the true things is that violent power, collectively organized, is a very powerful background fact. And it's a background fact that we're always struggling to manage. As a political scientist, I'll fall back on that one again. As a political scientist, I look at the reality of political societies as a fixed feature, and anarchy as being not meaningfully an answer to political questions. It tells us to imagine away the fact of collective control of the means of violence. But as soon as we've imagined them away, they are going to reassert themselves in fact. And so we face an ongoing political problem, how to secure a space for freedom against the problem that there are people who want to rule us, there are going to be means of ruling us, there are going to be aspirations of ruling us, there are going to be violent competitions over ruling us. We cannot say, well, we'll abolish ruling, and therefore there will be nothing to compete about, because they'll remember the possibility and they can bring it about again.
Professor Levy, thank you so much. We will see you again tomorrow. For everybody who's watching, thank you so much for joining us. We will see many of you and hope to see all of you at the 7:30 p.m. keynote by our president and CEO, Dr. Emily Chamley-Wright. Thanks again for attending, and see you soon.